Hi, Tin. How are you?
Hi, Erica. I'm very well, but I'm living in a house which has got many problems at the moment. There's a leak running underneath my kitchen at the moment, and they're just coming to dig it all up in a few days. So I shall have to do my washing up in the bathroom.
Oh my God, but you can manage. You
Yes,
can
I can
manage.
manage.
You
I
can
can
manage
manage.
that, isn't it? How are you? I mean, how is the situation in England with the COVID?
Well, it's not showing any real signs of improvements. We're still getting very large numbers of cases every day and still into the hundreds of deaths every day. So it's become a very difficult situation. We're still in more or less full lockdown with one or two exceptions. It's not quite as strict as the first time. But this time, people have just got completely weary with it. And also, people are completely confused about what they can and can't do. In Greece, I think it's much more simple. You can't do anything. Here, there are one or two exceptions. So that's how it is. But people psychologically are becoming very stressed about all this at the moment. And there's all sorts of anxieties, and people quite naturally have huge financial worries as well. And people are frightened about not being able to pay their rent or not their mortgage and their bills and all the rest of it. And so it's a state of really high stress. And I've never quite known anything like this before, throughout my whole life. And I've been in all sorts of different situations, but I've never come across anything that's quite like this before.
Yes, it's a very stressing situation for everyone. And hopefully the pandemic will pass very soon, isn't it, Tim? Because it's amazing. So hello everyone. I'm here with Tim Wyatt. My name is Erica Georgiadis. We are at the channel of the European School of Theosophy. And today we'll be talking with Tim. Tim is an esoteric writer, lecturer, researcher, and organizer. He has been a broadcast and print journalist for almost half a century, working for the BBC, ITV, and Sky, as well as for many newspapers, magazines, and online sites. He has won awards for his plays and TV documentaries. He has produced numerous TV films and articles, and currently writes for various esoteric magazines around the world. He is an international lecturer for the Theosophical Society and other organizations, and travels widely across Europe. He is the founder of the School of Applied Wisdom based in Leeds, and also helps to run Leeds Theosophical Society, where he has organized the successful Roots of Wisdom conferences over the past 5 years. He has written a great deal of poetry, more than 25 novels. That's a lot of novels, Tim, including Revoking The Reich, a fact-based novel outlining the true story of how during World War II, British intelligence used magic and psychic warfare to undermine the Third Reich. He has also written a number of factual books, including the highly praised Cycles of Eternity, an overview of the Ageless wisdom, which has been distributed to more than 40 countries. He has recently completed a shorter version of this book called Secrets of Infinity, to be published shortly. He is currently working on a major book about death, reincarnation, and karma called Everyone's Book of the Dead, to be published early in 2021. He is a lover of the natural world and lives in the Yorkshire Pennines with a cat called Electra. His other activities include writing and recording songs and playing the guitar. He has released 2 albums, including Atlantis, Outcome, and is currently preparing to record a new one. He is a keen book and art collector. Tim, welcome. Thank you for being here with me. And I have a picture that I want to share because you mentioned your cat, Electra, and then you sent me a picture, very interesting one of Electra here that I want to show. Tell me exactly what's going on there. What's happening, Tim?
Well, this is all really down to you, Erica, actually, indirectly, because as you well know, next year I'm going to be doing some talks based on the stanzas of Zan from Anthropogenesis, Volume 2 of The Secret Doctrine, for the European School Conference next year. And so I'm just researching these things. And what I did to cheat a little bit and make life easy for myself, I've taken the abridgment of The Secret Doctrine, which was written by Elizabeth Preston and Christmas Humphreys back in the 1960s. And I will read the full version, but just to reacquaint myself with all this stuff, because it's so complicated, I thought I'd start reading this. And every afternoon when I'm reading and researching, Electra's usually asleep next to me. And she just keeps taking an interest in this book for some reason. And I just saw her doing this, getting a little sneak look at it, and I thought I'd take a picture of her. But today I've had one or two other problems with her. I've just 5 minutes ago had to just deal with a rather unpleasant situation because she threw up all over the floor about 5 minutes before we started this. So I don't know whether that's down to reading The Secret Doctrine or whether it's to the food I've been feeding her.
Oh, come on. It's the food. It's the food that you have been giving to her. She's lovely. How old is she?
She's 4.5. I was given her in August 2016, and she had a brother who she's called Electra, and he was called Hermes, but he developed a habit of trying to run across the bypass, which runs about half a mile from my house. And one night he didn't quite make it and came into contact with a vehicle and got whizzed off to the astral plane. So there's just her now.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And I hope it's nothing serious. I hope she will get better soon. Something she ate might have affected her stomach, and she will be well soon.
Oh, I'm not at all worried. She does it all the time. So it's just what cats do,
So you were a singer and you play guitar. And when you were in Greece here last year, you were playing some wonderful songs, and it was so beautiful. I would like to share one of your songs with everyone. Listen to this talk, this chat that I'm having with Tim. I'm going to share the computer sounds. And then, Tim, could you comment a bit? What exactly is this that we are listening?
Well, the song's called Send Me Back to Earth School Again. And it's basically about someone who's stuck in the in-between life realms and wants to get back onto Earth, reincarnate again, and do it all again, basically. That's what it's about.
Write it. What was the year you wrote the song?
I wrote this in about 2014 and then recorded it about 5 years ago, which is when this album was recorded. So yeah, about 5 or 6 years ago it was recorded.
Okay, let's listen a little to it. We are listening to my dogs now. Why it's not out?
I'm restless in nirvana. I'm restless in nirvana. I'm bored with perfect bliss. Metaphysical martinis got me in their grip. Get me back on the physical plane. Give me a body, give me a brain. Send me back to Earth school again. Send me back to Earth school again. Amid the violence and the sickness, on an endless journey to the margins of existence. Getting me back on the physical plane. Give me a body, give me a brain. to Earth School again. Send me back to Earth School again.
That's so nice, Tim. You know, Elena, my daughter, every time that she listens to one of your albums, she loves you so much. Now, I'm restless here in Nirvana. I imagine that your image of Nirvana, it's of something that's not really interesting.
Well, it probably is, but it's meant to be quite an ironic song, really, because here we are on Earth, a very difficult time to be alive. And many of us are, particularly those of us who have an esoteric understanding of death, are quite looking forward to moving on to the next stage of our journey. But I imagine, like everything else, you know, if you have been in this wonderful in-between life for a period of time, however long that might be, whether it's a few years or a few centuries or whatever it happens to be, eventually the soul will get the impulse that it has to move on. It can't just sit around, you know, in this wonderful paradise. It has to come down here onto planet Earth, get down and dirty and go through all the crap that we have to go through in our lives in order to learn. Because obviously there are some things which can only be learnt here on the physical plane and which can't be learnt in the in-between states. That's not to say that we don't learn things, but some of the things that we have to do have to be resolved in this place. And I don't think it's any accident at all that 7.7 billion people have chosen to be here right now on this earth when it's experiencing such a wide range of different problems. I don't think we've ever faced such a multifaceted layer upon layer upon layer of problems, all which reinforce each other. So in one sense, there's been never a better time to reincarnate in terms of the richness of the experience, good and bad, which we can now attain at this particular period of history, in this particular epoch, as we move from one major cycle into another. So the song is kind of reflecting all this, and it's basically saying, here we are up in heaven in the afterlife realms, but let's go back to earth again, because that's what we still have to do. Unless, of course, any of us reach superhuman status between now and our next life, and we don't have to do that. But I think we're talking about very small numbers of people here.
Yeah, but even if we reach this superhuman state, the Theosophical system, for example, the Voice of the Silence says that there are two paths, the path of the Bodhisattva and the path of the Pratyeka Buddhas. And the Bodhisattva is that the journey which takes us to final liberation, but then we have to renounce the bliss of nirvana to reincarnate, to keep helping humanity, because we have to be, and all beings, because we have to be incarnated in the physical body. So it's actually a very theosophical song.
Oh yes, it is. I mean, it could be about a bodhisattva, someone who chooses to renounce the non-physical realms and come back to this very dense, harsh physical planet, which is sometimes compared to a prison come school. You know, that's what it is. It's a prison and a school with a few nice bits thrown in between to keep us all happy and stop us from cutting our throats.
Yeah. Can you tell me how you came in contact with theosophy for the first time? When, could you share with us, please?
Well, the very first time that I came across theosophy was more than 50 years ago, when I was at a school just literally a mile from where I now live. And they had, at that time, a very good public library. And it had a section which I always used to go to, and it was marked 133. And this is where you found all the kind of unusual, esoteric, occult books and everything. And at this time, in 1967 or 68, there was a great interest in these things because of all the hippie culture, the alternative culture, you know, the music, people taking LSD and all this stuff, and importing lots and lots of ideas from the East, the Beatles getting together with the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and all that sort of stuff. And I used to go to this section when I wasn't revising for my exams and look through all the books. And the first thing I came across one day was a copy of Isis Unveiled, and I took it home. I mean, it was, I was quite a strong boy at the time, but it was quite a heavy book to get home. And I thought my mother might not like this, so I had to kind of smuggle it into my bedroom. And I started reading it, and I found it, as you can imagine, for a 17-year-old or maybe even 16-year-old, it was very, very hard going. But it certainly planted some ideas in me, which I then began to explore. And then afterwards, when I was 18, 19, 20, I started seriously studying alchemy and various other spiritual things. But then what happened to me between the ages of about 25 and 45, I had a very busy and intense career as a journalist. I still work a bit as a journalist, but not so much. And I also had other issues in my life which I had to deal with, mainly relationships of one sort or another. And I didn't really read much of this stuff for a period of about 20 years, although I was always very interested in it. When you're working 10, 11, 12 hours a day, it's very difficult to do this. But then in 1995, my life completely changed. One day I was out somewhere and something happened and my life completely changed. And basically it just fell apart. And I had to completely reconstruct everything. And at this point, I then started to resume an interest in this. And I reread The Secret Doctrine, which I had come across in portions before. And I started reading lots of other books. And then eventually I got in the noughties, I got involved with the Theosophical Society in Bradford about 14 or 15 years ago. And from then on, it's become a central part of my life. As my professional life has receded, Theosophy has come to fill that void. And I do all sorts of different things now to try and further that, because I do think that Theosophy, even for a cynical old journalist like me, still provides the most comprehensive, panoramic, logical, and purposeful explanation of ourselves and the universe we inhabit. And it really does transcend the narrow-mindedness of some religions and some materialistic scientists and dry philosophers and other political philosophies which exist. It does provide, in my opinion, the very best explanation of who we are, where we've come from, and where we're going.
Well, I have met you. The first time we met, it was in 2012 at the summer school of the English section. Do you remember? Yes.
Yes, I remember very well.
I think that when did you actually become a member of the Theosophical Society? It was around that time, isn't it?
No, it was a little bit before that. I think I actually joined. I'd been going to meetings for some time before I actually joined. I think I actually joined in 2008, but I'd been attending meetings and studying and doing a lot of reading before I actually joined. So, and then I got very active and involved in the Theosophical Society and used to go to their summer school and sometimes give talks and everything. And that's where we met, because you were giving the Blavatsky lecture, which is the prestige, most important lecture of the whole week. So congratulations on that. And I remember the lecture very well. And I realized that when we met at that point, that you were someone who was very, very committed to all this, when we put your heart and soul into it, because not everybody wants to do that, and not everybody can do that. And there is a vast spectrum of people, some of whom are very, very on the fringes of it, and other people who are absolutely central to it, with all sorts of grades in between. But you are an extraordinarily committed theosophist, so I congratulate you on that.
Thank you, thank you. You are very committed to. You are very committed to, and it has been a wonderful experience to meet you. And you have been joining the European School of Theosophy since 2018. You have been on board with us. You are one of the main speakers that we have, and your work is wonderful. Could you share a bit, however, your work at the Leeds Lodge? The school you have founded, what's going on, and
yeah, certainly. Well, my role at Leeds Lodge is quite a varied one. We have because we own our own building, and we also own a couple of other bits and pieces. There's quite a lot of work to do to just keep everything going, because the building is more than 200 years old, like the house that I live in here, and there's always things going wrong with it and things that we need to do. But on a less material level, what I do, my main job is to help organize the lectures and also to put on conferences. We do at least 2 conferences a year. Dr. Paul Barker, who is the president of the lodge, he is a very knowledgeable Vedic astrologer, and so he puts on an international Vedic conference every autumn, and then every spring I run a conference called Roots of Wisdom. Now, obviously this year we had to cancel it because of the pandemic, and we weren't at that point in a position to do it online. But I also occasionally run a thing called the School of Applied Wisdom, because my own particular take on theosophy is that I like to try and present it to people who don't know much about it. And I like to try and present it, perhaps using whatever journalistic skills I have, to present it in a clear, concise, and plain way without too much Sanskrit in it. And I also like to try and present it as a living, breathing theosophy, not just something that you read in textbooks, but something which you can apply in your life and derive practical benefits from. And that's why I called it the School of Applied Wisdom. And it looks at things in a very basic way. For example, we talk a lot about cycles, these vast long cycles in theosophy, chains and rounds and globes and all the rest of it. And we talk about these cycles such as the one we're experiencing at the moment, going from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius. And when we're talking thousands or billions or trillions of years, it doesn't mean much. But when we see the cycles in our own personal lives, we can actually start to some degree to control those in some way. We know that we all as individuals go through cycles. We have good and bad days, we have good and bad years, we have moods which come and go. And so understanding cycles actually helps you to take control of your mental process to a greater degree than you might otherwise be able to do. It's not a complete panacea for it, but if you understand that cycles are cycles, but you can play an active part in cooperating with these cycles rather than trying to resist them. So that's one example that I would use. And the fact that just telling people that they're not just a bunch of bones with a load of flesh and blood vessels and a brain and all the rest of it, that we have more subtle parts to us. But I think the most important thing that we deal with at the School of Applied Wisdom, and the thing that I've applied myself to for a number of years now, certainly intensely for the last 4 or 5 years, is getting to grips with death, because death is something which mars a lot of people's lives. They're frightened of it, they don't understand it, they think it spells annihilation and oblivion. And I think re-educating people to say that we are part of an eternal continuum in which we spend portions of time in bodies here on earth and portions of time in between. And it's just one life lived through different bodies. If we could communicate that to more people, it would revolutionize the world in a fantastic way, because people would de facto start to become less materialistic. On the one hand, they wouldn't just think, oh, I'm only here once, I can do whatever I want, exploit the earth, get all this money, treat people terribly, become a billionaire and all the rest of it. And it would also teach people that everything that they do in this life, everything they say and think and feel, every action they perform has its consequences. Because if you believe in reincarnation, it doesn't work unless you have some other harmonizing principle attached to it, which is karma, the law of cause and effect. If you could teach these two things to people, it would change them at a stroke, and it would make them more spiritual people, because they would realize that they were more than just flesh and bone, despite what all mainstream science says about this. But I do think things are changing. I think science is beginning to cotton on to some of these things. And also when they do these surveys, and I frequently quote this, 50, 60 years ago, before the 1960s, reincarnation in the West was virtually unheard of, apart from a few esoteric circles, the Theosophical Society and one or two other academic people. And it kind of came into sharp focus. But now when they do these surveys, they find that between a quarter and a third of people believe in some form of rebirth. And in some of these surveys, one of the most ironic things is that more people believe in reincarnation than believe in God, which is quite an interesting thought.
Yes, it's very interesting, and I agree with you. I think perhaps a lot could change if the minds of people, they are not so much involved and embedded in material, superficial way of living, isn't it? Tim, you wrote many books, and then I have to ask you some questions about your books. I'm going to share here this one, which is Revoking the Reich. Could you comment a bit about this book, please?
Well, I've always been fascinated by the Second World War, and it's always been one of my areas of study. And from the 1950s onwards, when we first got a television, I used to watch all these wonderful films that they made in the late 40s and early 1950s about different aspects of the Second World War. And I was always interested in, I won't give too much away about the book, but I was always interested in the story of Rudolf Hess, who flew to Britain in 1941. The real reasons for this have never, ever really become clear. Some people say that he was on a peace mission to try and sue for peace with Britain. And some people say that Hitler knew all about this. Other people say that he didn't. But what I also discovered when I started to research all this was that during the war, both the Nazis and Britain used magicians, astrologers, various psychics, witches, to do certain things to try and undermine the enemy. For example, in 1940, just before the Battle of Britain started in June 1940, a group of witches gathered in a forest to conduct a very powerful ritual to raise what's known as a cone of power. And this was specifically to stop the Nazis invading. And whether it worked or not, I don't know, but the Nazis never did invade and they had the opportunity to do so. Later on, in 1941, there were all sorts of other people involved in this. The occultist Dion Fortune, whose real name was Violet Firth, and she was from Sheffield in South Yorkshire. She was a well-known occultist at the time, involved with the Theosophical Society, and she took part in this, in one of these rituals, certainly. And then a bit later on, there was another very elaborate ritual which involved all kinds of people, and there were many dozens of people there. They were guarded by around 200 Canadian troops. And this again was a ritual conducted in a forest at night. And in the original story, or the story that's come down to us, was that they used an effigy of a high-ranking Nazi, which was put on a pulley and sent symbolically back to Germany. Well, obviously, being a novelist, you have to kind of elaborate these things a little bit. And so I thought, well, rather than using a dummy Nazi, maybe they could have used Rudolf Hess and somehow done things to him psychologically, because certainly when we see Rudolf Hess again, and I researched his life throughout the war, he became completely unhinged. And very soon after captivity, actually tried to commit suicide. And when he appeared at the Nuremberg trials in 1945 and 1946, he was just incoherent. So did the British authorities do something to lure him over to Britain? If so, what were the reasons for that? And the book basically explores a number of these different things. And it's all, most of the characters in the book, even the spies at MI5 who cook all this up, they're all real people. And I researched the MI5 team that I think was responsible for this. But it also includes other people, Winston Churchill, King George the Sixth. I brought him into it as well because he was very, very interested in a number of these things. And then there's also the novelist Dennis Wheatley, and the novelist Ian Fleming. He played a very important role in this, as did an MP called Tom Dryburgh, who was later thought to be a triple agent, both for Britain and for the Russians. So it's got some incredibly colourful characters in all this. But the main character in the book is a fictional one, and he's a man called Josh Fuller, who has just finished getting a degree at Oxford when he gets recruited by this rather rogue branch of MI5 and gets set to work doing all sorts of other things. The book actually starts in the mid-1930s and it finishes in the summer of 1941. I've always been minded to perhaps write a sequel, but I need to sell the rest of the copies of this one first, I think. So it's quite interesting. It took a long time to write this book. It took 10 years or so to write it and finish it, because I kept losing my way with it and put it down and didn't touch it for 2 or 3 years, and then sent bits to people and said, oh, you must finish it, you must finish it. And so eventually I did. And I'm glad that I did, because I think it's quite an interesting story. It'd make a great TV program.
Yeah, I have read Himmler's diary. Did you read his diary? I think you did. Himmler's diary. Did you read it?
Yes.
In which he mentions that he was actually sending young married couples to make love on the tomb of their heroes, soldier heroes who have died during the war, to try to attract that soul, their soul to reincarnate. Do you remember this? So they were practicing magic. Yeah.
Well, Himmler and Hitler and others, top Nazis, were very, very into the occult. And there were some interesting societies around at that time. There's one called the Vril Society, which was based on a fictional energy which appears in a novel by the English novelist Bulwer Lytton in a book called The Coming Race. And he just imagined it as some big power like prana or fohat or kundalini or something like this, which could be very beneficial and healing, but could also be tremendously destructive. Well, the Nazis being the Nazis, they just bought all this hook, line and sinker, and they took this fictional Vril energy and turned it into a society. And this society became very, very influential with the Nazis, as did another one called the Fuel Society, the Gesellschaft, which was another organization that mixed occult ideas with racist ideology, and some of their stuff was pretty awful stuff. And they basically degraded occult ideas just the way they degraded everything else that they touched. So, you know, it's a very interesting thing to see that both the Germans and the Allies, well, certainly the British, used these occult means. And if they did that then, what are they doing now?
Well, that's a subject for a new book that you should write then. You know that regarding Lord Buller Lytton and de Vril, I think that one, it's mentioned in the Theosophical literature. Have you come across it?
Yes.
Yeah, have you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So now let's move forward to another one of your books, because you have many books, and we could be until tomorrow morning talking about all of them. The next one that you send me is, which actually I have a copy, is The Cycles of Eternity. Could you please comment a bit? What is this book about, Tim?
Well, this book is really a digest. Well, it's what it says. It's an overview of the ageless wisdom, and it takes the 6 or 7 key ideas that we talk about in theosophy: karma and reincarnation, cycles, the interconnectedness of life, the fact that everything is conscious, alive, and evolving, and the fact that there are subtle realms and all sorts of other things. And it just takes these basic ideas and explores them. And it does it in a way as I said earlier on, that I try to adopt with the School of Applied Wisdom. It's aimed at people who know absolutely nothing about this, but it's been extremely well received by people who have been studying theosophy for years, because as you well know, and as everybody knows who tries to study this, some of the literature is very obscure. A lot of it was written a long time ago. Madame Blavatsky's works are wonderful, but no one's going to say for a moment that they're easy to read, because they're not, and people are still reading them and getting things out of them, 140 years after they were first published. So what I wanted to do was to create something that people could sit down and read in maybe an hour or two, maybe in a lunch break or in the evenings, which would present all the ideas, not in any great detail, but just outline them and see how they all kind of fit together. And so I decided to do it with lots and lots of illustrations in it, because we live in a very visual age now. And if you present someone with a book that's like The Secret Doctrine, 650 pages that you could practically kill someone with, and they see all this dense type, most people now who've got the attention spans of fish because of the visual and digital media world we live in, they're not going to be able to read that. So you need to put lots and lots of nice pictures in there to seduce them into the book and get them to read it. And that was the approach. And it's the same thing that I've done with my new book on death. We haven't finished the cover yet, but that's what it's going to. I don't know if you can see it very well. It's called Everyone's Book of the Dead, and this has also got lots and lots of pictures in them. Some of them quite gory, because being about death, you have to show it in all its different aspects. And then this is Secrets of Infinity, which is basically something that's a digest of a digest. This is something that's designed for people to read in half an hour, and it just goes through the main ideas and shows that the ideas are different to the way science or religion explains them. The science and religion thing is quite big in this. This is not published yet. It should be published at the same time as my book on death in a couple of months from now, I hope, round about the beginning of 2021.
Yeah. I don't know what's happening with my mic. The cover of the book is beautiful, Tim. I love it.
Yes, well, I work very closely with a designer here in England, and he lives only 20 yards away from my house. And he also feeds Electra when I'm on my travels in various places. But he's a wonderful designer, and we've worked very well together. He's designed all my books, and we've developed a very good way of working together, and this always helps, really. But I do think that illustrating books these days is so important, and the fact that they now have printing technologies where you can do color books for not much more than black and white books. There used to be a huge difference in the past, but now they have digital printing and various other techniques. It's almost as cheap to do it, and I think it makes it much more appealing to the reader. We can't still pretend that it's the 1890s and that people have got many hours of leisure, because they don't. And so to be brief and to be concise and clear, I think, is what my mission in all this is, if I have a mission.
You say that someone can read the book in 30 minutes. I mean, how many pages is the book?
Oh, this one's only about 24 pages, that's all.
It's very small, yeah. That's beautiful.
It did actually start out life as...
Yeah, the cover, you feel like you are entering in it. It's beautiful, yeah.
It did start life as something else, which we won't go into for political reasons, but it eventually turned into this. It started out as one project with somebody else, and then various things happened, and it just basically turned into this. But that's what often happens with these things. They start out as one thing, and then midway through, some kind of transformation takes place and they become something else.
And what about Everyone's Book of the Dead? I love the title. I must say that I love the title. Everyone's Book of the Dead. It's amazing. A panoramic compendium of death and dying. When is the book is going to be in the market?
Well, I'm hoping to have it on sale by January or February. I'm just resetting up my website to do this. That's under construction at the moment, and so the books also are still at the final design stage. So we're looking at January or February when people can buy them from the website, or possibly, I don't know whether I'm going to sell them on Amazon and all that sort of thing. I need to take advice from people who know more about these things than I do. But the title of the book comes from the fact that I was very well aware, well, there's a Tibetan Book of the Dead, is the Egyptian Book of the Dead. So I thought, well, why shouldn't there be a Book of the Dead for everyone? You know, why should it just be the Tibetans and the Egyptians who have one? I'm sure there are other ones as well. And the idea of the book was to look at the theosophical view of death, but also to look at how other people see death and how death has been seen in different religious and spiritual traditions down the ages, and how people have dealt with death psychologically, how people have conducted different kinds of funeral rites, what people's beliefs have been about the afterlife, the similarities or the way that some cultures don't believe in reincarnation, but most of them do have some idea either of rebirth as humans, or in some cases, in some traditions, rebirth as other kingdoms of nature, such as trees or more commonly animals. So it goes into death in all sorts of different ways, and it explores what happens when we die. It looks at different views of reincarnation, and it looks at the evidence as such for reincarnation, which was a topic that I dealt with last year in Greece at the Reincarnation Conference of the European Schools. So I've incorporated all that, and there is actually a voluminous amount of evidence for reincarnation, and certainly for the existence of other realms through things like hypnotic regression, near-death experiences. All the time when you watch the television, they've got documentaries about this sort of stuff, and the similarities that people describe when they, for example, are having an operation or they've had an accident and they are officially dead for a few minutes. And they all describe very, very similar things, going down a passageway or a tube or a tunnel and emerging into bright light and being met by family or spiritual beings or Jesus or Buddha or whoever, and then being taken through a beautiful landscape until they reach some kind of barrier, a wall, a stream, a mountain or something like that. And they're told by whoever it is with them, okay, Tim, you can't go any further. You're going to have to go back. And you say, but I don't want to go back. I'm home now. I want to stay here. It's not your time. You have to go back. They take you back, and then you come back in your body. And one of the most vivid examples of this that I was researching is an excellent book by a man called Dr. Aben Alexander called Proof of Heaven. Now, this is particularly interesting for a number of reasons, because Aben Alexander was an absolute arch skeptic about anything spiritual, anything to do with the afterlife. He was a materialistic scientist, and he was a neurosurgeon, so he knows exactly how the brain works. And one day he got meningitis, and he was sent into a deep coma, such a bad coma, and such horrific damage was being done to his brain that it wasn't expected that he would recover. And he was unconscious for a period of about 7 days. And he went through these incredible experiences, which I won't start to describe now. Read the book, it's fantastic. And he goes through all these different layers called the core and the inner part. And he meets all sorts of entities and sees all kinds of things. But he knows when he recovers and realizes all this and starts to write the book, that it wasn't his brain doing this, because there was nothing to function in his brain. So this convinced him that brain and mind are not necessarily the same thing, that you can have mind without a brain, although on the physical level, the brain is the processor for the mind. But it seems that the mind exists outside the body in some way that materialistic scientists can't understand. And it's often been said, for example, that the brain is like a TV receiver rather than a video recorder. It taps into something beyond itself. So all these things are dealt with in the book, and various instances of other proofs. We had a very interesting man at the European School last year, Jim Tucker, who, with his predecessor Ian Stevenson, spent decades in places like India researching the memories of young children who said they'd been born in a village 50 miles down the road, and their mother was called this and their father was called that, and they'd had an uncle who had a truck that was yellow, and describing all sorts of details. But also he looked at the wounds and marks that sometimes children were born with. And these often seem to correspond to the way in which this child, or the child they claim to have been, actually died, because they checked it against mortuary records, inquests, police reports, and all kinds of other things. And they found numerous cases where if someone had been shot in the head, they had a residual mark on them in this life. None of these things are actual proof of reincarnation, and you never will prove any of this to the skeptics, because they're asking for physical proof of something that is entirely non-physical. So, you know, that's very difficult to do. It's like trying to knit water. You can't do it.
Yes, I don't know what's happening with my mic. Anyway, I remember last year you wrote something about an experience on memories of past life, or could you share a bit with us,
Well,
please?
yes. Well, there's two things here. About 15 years ago, I underwent a series of, I think, 3 or 4 quite long hypnotic regression sessions with a woman, a hypnotist who was well trained to do this. And the stuff that emerged was extremely interesting. And the most recent incarnation, I actually had a name for this person and all sorts of details of where they'd worked. And so naturally, I tried to check it out, and it didn't check out. There was no such person. But nevertheless, there was an authenticity to this experience. So whether it was my experience or whether I was tapping into someone else's experience, I don't know. But I also remember incarnations as the wife of a French novelist in the 1880s. And I know it was that because in the background to their apartment where she used to sit and read, the Eiffel Tower was being built. So you can date it almost precisely. And I checked out a few French novelists and wasn't quite sure. And then I had another interesting incarnation as a man called Brother Amos. Brother Amos lived in the 11th or 12th century, and he was some sort of monk come spy. It might have been later, it might have been the 13th or 14th century. It's difficult to say. And he used to scurry about the country delivering secret manuscripts to various monastic institutions. So he seems to have been like a kind of undercover agent working for the monasteries of some kind. The earliest memory I had was probably about 3,000 years ago in Lebanon, when I was some kind of metals trader dealing in precious metals like gold and silver. So there was all that, and I wanted to do it because just to see what it was like more than anything else, and just to see what the techniques were. And I remained completely open-minded about it. But earlier on, we were talking about the Second World War and how I was always attracted to these films about the Second World War, because one of the things that is clear that after wars, and it's primarily in most wars young men who are killed, and many of those want to get back into physical incarnation as soon as possible. So you always see a boom in the birth rate after the First World War, and certainly after the Second World War. So there's a lot of evidence for this, but I was always attracted to particular films about the desert. There was a very famous one called The Desert Rats, another one called Ice Cold and Alex, featuring all those wonderful British actors. And even when I was very young, 6 or 7 years old, and these films came onto the television, or we went to the cinema to see them, I always felt this absolute feeling that I had been there in the desert in the Second World War. And I was absolutely convinced of this. And I used to have dreams as a young boy of my body being loaded into the back of one of those field ambulances and the doors closing to show the big red cross on the back. Now, interestingly enough, my father was a sergeant in the army in the war. He served in the desert, but he survived it. He had two brothers, Jack and Joe, who were both sergeants in the army, and one of them was actually killed in the desert shortly before the big Battle of El Alamein in 1942. I'm not quite clear of the exact circumstances of how he was killed, but he's now buried in Heliopolis Cemetery in Egypt. And well, I thought about this for a long time, and eventually I started thinking, well, supposing I was him and had come back as part of some kind of karmic script. Because one of the things that's very evident about reincarnation is that people come back in groups, and they play different roles, like in a theater. In one life, I'm your mother. In the next, I'm your worst enemy. In the next, I'm business partner. And so we continually interact with groups of souls. So maybe it was that I came back to fulfill some kind of karmic role. But what makes this even more interesting is that none of these people are my blood relatives. I was adopted at 6 weeks old by this family. So could there have been some convoluted and complex way in which I had to come back and be involved with that same family? This is pure speculation, but I feel it very, very strongly. I have a kind of inner conviction that there is certainly some truth to all this.
Well, that it may be, there may be, because I think that we have to follow our inner intuition, as you mentioned, and all these experiences that you shared with us, to let you to think and to feel that there is this connection, there might be. And Tim, for those watching our talk, and now changing a bit subject, talking a little about the pandemic, what would be your advice for those who are in lockdown or are feeling fear or anxious, what they could do to feel better, to go through these very, very challenging and difficult moments in feeling better?
Well, this pandemic now, I think, almost threatens to do as much, if not more, psychological damage to people as it is doing to some people physically. I mean, it's killed 1.3 million people around the world now, and that's a very, very large number. However, when we put it into perspective, there are 7.7 billion people, so it still is a relatively small number. It is affecting adversely certain age groups, people of my age and older, but it's clearly having a very, very detrimental effect on young people especially, and on people who are vulnerable because they are lonely, and there are a lot of lonely people in this world. And one of the ironies I always think, Erica, is the fact that here we have this world that's more interconnected than ever, and yet we're more and more divorced from each other. It's almost like this connecting technology, yes, it does join us, but it also separates us and alienates us in some way. So I'm very worried about the psychological damage that's being done to people, because we've never had this before in quite such a configuration. Even during wartime in Britain, people were able to some extent, go out to pubs and to dance halls, and they were able to mix freely, and societies were still able to operate, and all sorts of other things were still relatively normal. But here, for the first time, we're being separated from each other in a way that none of us have ever seen before. And a lot of people have said to me, very mild-mannered people who I speak to every day as they pass my house, they say things like, this is like living in Nazi Germany or East Germany or North Korea or something. It's like a police state. We feel that we are somehow have been criminalized because of all this. And the young people feel this absolutely intensely. They feel that the most important years of their life, particularly those students who go to university for the first time, they feel it's being stolen from them. So I worry about all this. I mean, clearly you've got to take sensible precautions about all this, and you've got to deal with this in a practical way. But you also have to balance out the fact that this is causing huge damage. I mean, when they collect the statistics, I'm sure that the suicide rate will have gone up hugely in many countries because people have reached a point of despair. And when people are lonely and isolated and alienated anyway, it doesn't necessarily take very much to drive them over the edge. And so I think it's been very good that certain people have very much tried to engage with some of these people and talk to them on the phone, or even where possible, visit these people. And there's been a lot of that going on, people looking out for neighbours and everything in a way that probably wouldn't have happened to the same extent before. Where I live here in my small town in Yorkshire, people are very friendly and very neighbourly anyway. Well, most of them are. And so that happens. But there's been an even greater sense of, oh, is there anything that you need, particularly towards the older people. So it has brought out a degree of compassion as well, and altruism, I have to say, in a lot of people.
Yes.
How this is going to plan out, I just don't know. I mean, the conspiracies obviously are running rife about all this, and it was planned, and they want to microchip us and all this kind of stuff. And I don't think this is necessarily very helpful stuff either, because it just further frightens people. And so one of the ways to deal with fear, and one of the ways that you always deal with fear in a war, is through humor, and by people laughing at things, and by people being able to stand outside themselves and, if necessary, laugh at themselves. But humor is so important in this situation. And I think, as Rupert Sheldrake said in his talk a few weeks back, another important thing that really helps us to get through this as a survival tool is gratitude. We have to be grateful for what we have, not angry and enraged by a situation that's beyond most people's control. We do have to be grateful for the things that we do have in life. So I worry for a lot of people about all this, and I think there will be a lot of long-term damage to people psychologically. But how we can deal with it anymore effectively, I think people need to think about this, and we need to unleash that wonderful human imagination, because the human imagination works best in a crisis often, necessity being the mother of invention.
Yes, we have decided, we have me and others at the school, at the European school, we have been discussing about the possibility of creating a theosophical circle for support, a theosophical support circle. So it would be basically, of course, it would be on Zoom, and then people that they would, theosophists or sympathizers, that they would be feeling lonely or challenged. It would be private, it will not be filmed. They would join us, and we would talk and meet each other, and perhaps, it wouldn't be lectures or anything, but a support group, because there is a lot of people feeling very lonely. Tim, another day I was here, and I went down the road with the car to do something, and I was waiting someone, and then there was this gentleman. He was a very old man, like 94 years old. He approached me, and he was crying, and then he told me, "I do not know what to do. I want to go to buy some tomatoes, and there is no public transport because of the lockdown, and I'm starving," he said. And he's a lonely man. He has nobody. And he told me, "I'm thinking to commit suicide." And then I told him, I helped him. He showed me his home, and then I went to the supermarket because I have a car, and I made a shopping for him, and I brought him groceries. But there is a lot of people in a situation similar to this gentleman, and then it's really sad. we have to do our best to help and support each other. And I think that your message, that humor and being there to help the other, but not only through the internet, but also in our neighborhood, it's very important, isn't it?
Yeah, you've got to start where you are, just wherever it is you live, and even small acts of kindness can go a long way. But I think your idea for this support circle is an excellent one, because you have to remember that certainly amongst theosophists, many theosophists live by themselves, and also many of them have been studying it for years, and they're very elderly. And these are two particular groups of people that who could benefit greatly from all this. So I think it's a wonderful idea, and it could be set up. Well, it could be set up internationally or locally or regionally, or a mixture of all these things. But that would be theosophy in action, wouldn't it? That would be practical living theosophy, because it's offering practical assistance to someone who needs it at this particular time. So if you want any help with that, I'd be very happy to do whatever I can.
Yeah, it will be fantastic if you can join us in this project, because I know you are a singer and you have a marvelous human, and then we have to be there for each other and to support each other. Then we are talking 1 hour. Can you believe that? 1 hour is gone. So I would like to close with a positive note. Would you like to give a message, last message before we close, and then I will play your song before cutting the live?
Okay. Well, I think that despite all the difficulties that we're going through, and difficulties which have been accelerating over the last few years and decades, be they political or ecological or financial, or the ill distribution of wealth and all sorts of other things, despite all this, human beings are getting smarter. And human beings are also not just doing it with their minds, they're also becoming more spiritualized slowly. And by that, I mean they are developing new faculties like intuition or the wisdom intuition principle, if you like. So human beings are some way in the process of getting a major spiritual upgrade at the moment. And this probably is responsible for a lot of the upheavals that are going on. But if we can understand it in terms of what's happening in the longer term, it makes it more understandable for people now to see why these difficulties are happening. The old ways didn't work, and so we have to change these ways, and change is always going to be painful. So we've just kind of got to grin and bear it, and do more grinning than bearing, I suppose.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. We are going to play Tim's song before we close.
I'm restless in nirvana, I'm bored with perfect bliss. Metaphysical martinis